The evening started with excitement and anticipation, but I had no idea how it would spiral into chaos. My wife, Sarah, and I were invited to a private swinger party by her boss, David, and his stunning wife, Lisa. It wasn't something we did often, but the allure of the unknown and the promise of an exhilarating night drew us in. Sarah seemed enthusiastic, which was a bit surprising. We'd been struggling with routine lately, and maybe this was her way of reigniting the spark. David was charismatic, a natural leader who always knew how to command a room, while Lisa was every bit as captivating, confident, elegant, and with an undeniable sensuality that turned heads wherever she went. They were the kind of couple you couldn't ignore, and when they suggested this private party, it felt like a chance to step out of our comfort zone. The venue was discreet, tucked away in an upscale neighborhood, far from prying eyes. As we arrived, the soft glow of lanterns lit a pathway that led us through a lush garden to the entrance. Music hummed in the background, mingling with the soft chatter of other guests. The air was charged with excitement, and I could feel the energy of the place seep into my bones. Inside, the mood was seductive, dim lighting, plush furniture, and a sea of beautiful, confident people dressed in sleek, provocative attire. It was clear everyone here was familiar with the rules of the game: discretion, pleasure, and no judgments. David and Lisa greeted us warmly, their presence commanding but welcoming. Drinks were poured, and the evening began to unfold in a haze of laughter, flirtation, and glances that lingered a little too long. Lisa gravitated towards me almost immediately. She had this magnetic pull, a kind of raw confidence that was hard to resist. I tried to stay close to Sarah, but Lisa kept inching closer, her touch lingering on my arm longer than it should. She whispered compliments that sent a rush of adrenaline through me, and I could feel my resolve slipping away. Meanwhile, Sarah seemed to be enjoying herself, chatting with David, who had his own effortless charm. It wasn't long before Lisa and I were lost in conversation, the flirtation growing more intense with each passing moment. I was aware of Sarah in my periphery, but Lisa's allure was overpowering. She leaned in, her breath warm against my ear as she whispered, "You should let loose tonight. I've seen the way you look at me." Her words sent a shiver down my spine. I glanced over at Sarah and David. They seemed engrossed in their own world, laughing, with David's hand resting on the small of her back. Before I knew it, Lisa was guiding me to one of the private rooms upstairs. The room was dimly lit, with a large bed at the center draped in silk sheets. It felt surreal, like stepping into a different reality where inhibitions were stripped away. I hesitated, thinking about Sarah, but Lisa's touch was electric, pulling me back into the moment. We kissed, and I let go, succumbing to the heat of the night. As things escalated between us, a part of me felt a twinge of guilt, but the thrill of the forbidden kept me hooked. I told myself that Sarah and I had come here together, that she was downstairs enjoying herself too, maybe even exploring her own boundaries. That thought gave me a twisted sense of justification, allowing me to push any doubts aside. After some time, I needed a moment to collect myself. I excused myself to use the bathroom, feeling lightheaded from the mix of alcohol and adrenaline. The hallway was quiet, a stark contrast to the music and chatter from downstairs. As I walked towards the bathroom, I heard muffled sounds coming from one of the rooms down the hall, a rhythmic creaking of a bed, soft moans, and whispers that sent a cold shiver down my spine. Instinctively, I stopped in front of the partially open door. I peeked inside, and that's when I saw them, Sarah and David tangled together on the bed. My wife's moans filled the room as David moved aggressively, his hands gripping her hips with an intensity that made my stomach churn. It wasn't just the physical act, it was the look on Sarah's face, pure, unrestrained pleasure, like I'd never seen before. For a moment, I was frozen, unable to process what I was witnessing. Rage, betrayal, and confusion hit me all at once. This wasn't the plan. We were supposed to explore together, not separately. And certainly not like this. My heart pounded in my chest as I watched them, each second feeling like an eternity. Everything I thought I knew about my wife, about us, was unraveling before my eyes. The fantasy had turned into a nightmare, and I knew things would never be the same again. I stumbled back, gripping the wall for support, my mind spinning in disbelief at what I'd just seen. My breath hitched, and I felt my blood boiling. The image of Sarah and David seared into my brain. It was one thing to share an experience in a controlled setting, but this felt like a betrayal of the worst kind. My wife lost in the arms of her boss while I'd been upstairs, wrapped up in my own indiscretion. I couldn't stay there, couldn't stand to hear the sounds of her moans mixed with David's grunts any longer. I needed to confront this head-on, but I wasn't sure how. My heart raced as anger surged through me. I kicked the door open without thinking and they froze. The room fell silent. The only sound left was my own ragged breathing. Sarah's eyes widened in shock as she pushed David away, scrambling to cover herself with the sheets. David looked momentarily stunned but didn't seem half as bothered as he should have been. In fact, he had this smug look on his face, like he'd won some sick game. "What the hell is this?" I shouted, my voice breaking the tense silence. I looked at Sarah, searching her eyes for any sign of remorse, but all I saw was a mix of fear and something else, something that twisted the knife even deeper. Was it satisfaction? Relief? I couldn't tell, but whatever it wasn't the guilt I had expected. "Wait, Sarah stammered, her face flushed and her hands trembling as she clutched the sheets tighter. She looked so different, wild, disheveled, like a stranger I'd never met before tonight. "You," I spat, struggling to form words through the rage bubbling inside me. "You're screwing your boss?" Now. David didn't bother to cover up. He leaned back casually, wiping the sweat off his forehead with a satisfied grin. "Relax, man," he said, shrugging like this was no big deal. "This is what we're here for, right? No need to make it personal." "Personal?" I barked, feeling my fists clench at my sides. "You think this is just some casual hookup? She's my wife." Sarah's eyes darted between us and she reached out, trying to calm me. "It's not what you think, it just happened." "It just happened?" I echoed, incredulous. "How does something like this just happen, Sarah? We came here together and now you're—" "It was a moment," she whispered, tears welling up in her eyes. But even in her apology, I sensed an undercurrent of defiance, something she was holding back. David was her boss, a man who'd always had a strange influence over her. I'd seen how she looked at him in meetings, the little glances she thought I didn't notice. But I never imagined she'd cross that line. Not like this. My head spun as I tried to piece it together. What had led her to this? Was this just a spontaneous betrayal fueled by the night's atmosphere, or was it something deeper? Had she been drawn to his power, his confidence, the way he commanded her attention in a way I couldn't anymore? I realized that, somewhere along the way, I'd lost Sarah's gaze. She was looking at David now, waiting for him to speak, to explain away the unexplainable. "Let's just calm down and talk about this like adults," David said, still annoyingly composed. His arrogance only fueled my rage further. He got off the bed slowly, as if this was all just a misunderstanding that could be sorted out with a few words. "Talk about what, David?" I snapped, turning my attention fully to him now. "You think you can just sleep with my wife and then brush it off with some smug line? This isn't some business deal you can negotiate your way out of." He smirked, leaning against the wall, crossing his arms casually. "You wanted this, didn't you? To explore, to step outside the lines. This is what happens when you open that door. People do things they wouldn't normally do." I stepped forward, my chest tightening with fury. "You're her boss. This wasn't part of any plan, this was you taking advantage. And you," I turned to Sarah, struggling to keep my voice from breaking, "you just went along with it." Sarah's face crumpled and she began to cry, but I wasn't sure if it was out of regret, guilt, or because she'd been caught. I wanted to believe she was sorry, that this was some terrible mistake, but the truth was staring me in the face, and it was ugly. "It's not that simple," she sobbed, shaking her head. "I didn't mean for it to happen like this." "Then why did it?" I demanded, my voice rising. "You're not just some passive player in this, Sarah. You wanted this too." Her tears flowed freely now, and for a moment, I almost felt sorry for her, but the anger and betrayal ran too deep. I turned and stormed out of the room, not sure where I was going, but knowing I couldn't be in there any longer. The party that had once felt liberating now seemed suffocating, the music grating against my nerves. I made my way back to the main area, where Lisa, David's wife, was mingling with guests, completely unaware of the storm brewing upstairs. I approached her, still seething, and she looked up at me with a coy smile, completely oblivious to what had just happened. "Hey, where'd you run off to?" she asked playfully, but her smile faded when she saw my expression. I pulled her aside, needing to get this out, needing someone else to feel what I was feeling. "Lisa, I don't know what you think is going on, but your husband is upstairs, screwing my wife." She blinked, taken aback, her playful demeanor collapsing into shock. For a split second, I saw her struggle to comprehend what I'd said, and then the realization hit her. She tried to keep her composure, but I could see the fury building behind her eyes. "Where is he?" she demanded, her voice shaking as she tried to mask the hurt. "Upstairs. Room at the end of the hall." Without another word, she stormed off, leaving me standing there, feeling a mix of satisfaction and guilt for dragging her into this mess. I watched as she disappeared into the hallway, her heels clicking angrily against the polished floors. The fallout was just beginning, and none of us would come out of it unscathed. This was supposed to be an adventure, a shared experience, but now it felt like the beginning of the end. As I stood alone in the dimly lit hallway, my mind raced, the heavy thump of bass from the music below vibrating through my chest. I couldn't shake the image of Sarah beneath David, the look of reckless abandon on her face, a look I hadn't seen in years. My throat tightened, anger giving way to a sinking feeling of loss that I couldn't outrun. The woman I thought I knew, the woman I'd loved and built a life with, was suddenly a stranger to me. How had we reached this point? What had gone so wrong? I leaned against the wall, staring blankly at the pattern on the carpet, the sounds of distant laughter and clinking glasses grating on my nerves. I wanted to smash something, to find a release for the fury and pain clawing at my insides. But all I could do was stand there, paralyzed by the weight of what I'd just seen. My heart ached, each beat echoing the betrayal I couldn't unsee. From the end of the hall, I heard a door slam and Lisa's voice cut through the noise, sharp, angry, and laced with venom. She stormed out, her face flushed and eyes brimming with tears. Behind her, David followed, trying to calm her down, but she shoved him away, disgust written all over her face. "You're a bastard, David," she yelled, her voice trembling with rage. "How could you do this to me? Here, of all places." She turned to me, her anger momentarily shifting to confusion. "Did you know about this?" I shook my head, feeling my own emotions boiling over again. "No. I found out the same time you did." Lisa's lip quivered, and she glanced back at David, who stood with his hands raised in a pitiful attempt to placate her. It was in the moment, Lisa. "You know how these things go," he said, his voice annoyingly calm, as if he was explaining a simple mistake rather than shattering two marriages. Lisa laughed bitterly, a sound that cut through the music and chatter like a knife. "Oh, I know how these things go? Really, David? Is that your excuse? You think screwing his wife while I'm downstairs, chatting up his husband, is something that just happens?" David's eyes flicked between us, but it was clear he didn't have any answers. He looked less like the smooth, confident man I'd known and more like a kid caught with his hand in the cookie jar. Sarah, who had trailed out of the room behind them, was pale and visibly shaking, her eyes darting between me and Lisa. She tried to approach me, her hand reaching out as if to touch me, but I recoiled, stepping back instinctively. "Don't," I said, my voice low and strained, the anger bubbling up to the surface. "Don't touch me." "I'm sorry," she whispered, tears spilling down her cheeks. Her voice was small, almost childlike, and for a moment, I saw the Sarah I had fallen in love with, the vulnerable, sweet woman who had once looked at me like I was her entire world. But now that look was gone, replaced by guilt and confusion, and it broke something deep inside me. "Sorry? You're sorry?" I snapped, my voice rising. "How does that fix anything, Sarah? How does that make this okay? We were supposed to be in this together." She wrapped her arms around herself, hugging the silk robe tighter as if trying to shield herself from the reality we were facing. I didn't plan this. I don't even know why it happened. It felt good to be wanted like that." Her words hit me like a punch to the gut, knocking the wind out of me. "Wanted? You're my wife. You think I don't want you? You think I haven't been trying to fix this, trying to connect with you? She flinched, tears streaming down her face. It's not that simple. You don't understand how it feels to be ignored, to feel invisible. Her voice cracked, and she looked down, her vulnerability on full display. David paid attention. He made me feel alive. Alive? I echoed, my chest tightening. And what am I, Sarah? Just some dead weight you carry around? No, she cried, stepping closer, desperation written all over her face. I love you. I do. But we've been so disconnected. And I've been feeling lost, like I'm just a shadow of myself. I turned away, unable to look at her without feeling the sting of betrayal. I wanted to scream, to shake her, to make her understand how much she'd hurt me. But I knew that would solve nothing. I had been blind to her loneliness, too caught up in my own world to notice the cracks forming in ours. But this wasn't the answer. Lisa, who had been silently fuming, finally broke her silence. She pointed a finger at David, her face contorted with fury and hurt. You're pathetic, you know that? You think you're some kind of king, that you can just take whatever you want, no matter who gets hurt in the process. David tried to reach for her, but she slapped his hand away, the sound echoing through the hallway. Don't you dare touch me, she hissed, her voice low and venomous. You're not worth it. She looked at me then, her eyes softening for the briefest moment. I'm sorry you got dragged into this. You deserved better. Her voice wavered, and I saw the pain in her eyes mirrored in my own. This wasn't how any of us had imagined the night would go. We were four broken people standing in the ruins of our choices, each of us grappling with the reality of what had just happened. I nodded, unable to find the right words. Yeah, we all deserved better. The weight of the situation hung heavy in the air, and I knew that whatever came next wouldn't be easy. There was no quick fix, no way to undo the damage that had been done. As Lisa stormed past David, I watched her disappear down the stairs, her back straight but her steps unsteady, like she was holding herself together by sheer force of will. I looked back at Sarah, who stood there, lost and broken, and for a moment, I didn't know what to do. All I knew was that everything had changed and there was no going back. The party continued around us, oblivious to the chaos unfolding just down the hall. We were no longer the carefree couple we'd pretended to be, we were something else entirely, something fractured and raw. I turned away, the anger simmering into a cold, empty resolve. There was so much left unsaid, so many questions that would never have simple answers. But right now, all I wanted was to get out of that house, away from David's smug face, away from the memories of what I'd seen. Let's go, I said, my voice barely more than a whisper. Sarah hesitated, her eyes searching mine for a sign of forgiveness that I wasn't ready to give. She nodded silently, and together we left the party, the music fading into the background as we stepped into the cool night air. It felt like the end of something we couldn't quite define, but the beginning of something else, something that neither of us was ready to face. The drive home was suffocating. I gripped the steering wheel so tightly my knuckles turned white, and the silence between us was unbearable. I could feel Sarah glancing at me, her eyes pleading for something I couldn't give. Words spun around in my mind, but I couldn't bring myself to speak. What was there to say? Everything felt meaningless, every apology hollow, every explanation an insult to what we once had. Sarah sat beside me, fidgeting with the hem of her dress, her fingers trembling. She opened her mouth to speak several times, but each time, the words died before they could find life. I kept my eyes on the road, the streetlights casting long, flickering shadows inside the car. I wanted to yell, to make her feel the rage that was eating me alive, but I was afraid of what I might say, afraid that once I started, I wouldn't be able to stop. As we pulled up to our house, I cut the engine and stared straight ahead, the weight of what had happened pressing down on me like a heavy stone. The house felt different, like a shell of the home we'd built together. It was just walls and windows now, holding memories that suddenly seemed tainted. I didn't want to go inside, didn't want to face the reality of sharing the same space with Sarah after what I'd seen. She finally spoke, her voice barely above a whisper. Please, can we talk? The sound of her voice, so fragile and full of pain, hit me hard. But I wasn't ready for this conversation, not now, maybe not ever. What's there to talk about, Sarah? You made your choice. She flinched as if I'd slapped her, her eyes glistening with fresh tears. I never meant to hurt you. I swear, I didn't want this. I was just lost. Lost? I laughed bitterly, shaking my head. You didn't look lost in there. You looked like you were exactly where you wanted to be. That's not fair, she said, her voice breaking. You don't understand how lonely I've felt. You're always so distant, always focused on everything else but me. Her words stung, slicing through the anger to the guilt that I'd been trying to ignore. I knew she wasn't entirely wrong. Work, stress, life, I'd let it all consume me, pushing her needs to the back burner without even realizing it. But her betrayal felt like a punishment that far outweighed my mistakes. So this is my fault now? That's why you slept with your boss. She covered her face with her hands, sobbing into her palms, and for a moment, all my anger faltered. I hadn't seen her cry like this in years, not since we'd lost our first pregnancy, a moment that had broken us in ways we'd never fully healed from. I wanted to reach out, to pull her close and tell her it would be okay, but my hands stayed firmly in my lap. There was no comfort to give, only the cold, harsh reality of what we'd become. Why him? I asked quietly, the question that had been burning in my mind finally escaping. Why David? She looked up, her face streaked with tears, and her voice trembled as she tried to find the right words. I don't know, he paid attention. He noticed me. I felt seen. I clenched my jaw, fighting back the urge to scream. I see you, Sarah. I've always seen you. But you never said anything. You never told me you felt like this. She sniffled, wiping her tears with the back of her hand. I didn't know how. I didn't even realize how bad it was until tonight. I thought this would make it better. Better. I repeated, incredulous. You think screwing another man would make things better? You didn't fix anything, Sarah. You've just broken us even more. She sobbed harder, curling into herself as if she could make the world disappear by sheer force of will. I watched her, a mix of anger, sadness, and regret swirling inside me. I wanted to comfort her, to tell her we could work through this, but I didn't know if I believed it myself. How do you come back from something like this? How do you rebuild trust when it's been shattered into 1,000 pieces? I opened the car door, the cool night air hitting me like a slap to the face. I needed to get away from her, from the suffocating weight of this conversation. I needed to think, to breathe. I'm going for a walk, I said, not looking back. I need some air. Please don't go, she pleaded, her voice breaking with desperation. We can't just leave this like this. But I was already halfway down the driveway, my steps heavy and uneven. I walked aimlessly, each step fueled by anger, hurt, and the gnawing emptiness that had taken root in my chest. I wandered through our neighborhood, the familiar streets feeling foreign and unwelcoming. My mind kept replaying the scene from the party, Sarah's face twisted in pleasure as David moved against her. It was like a nightmare on loop, and no matter how hard I tried, I couldn't turn it off. I found myself at the park where we used to go on lazy Sunday afternoons, the place where we'd first talked about our dreams, our future, the family we wanted to build together. I sat down on the cold metal bench, staring at the empty playground, and for the first time that night, I let the tears fall. I wasn't just angry, I was heartbroken. This wasn't just about a single night of betrayal, it was the culmination of years of neglect, of missed signals, of letting life get in the way of love. I pulled out my phone, staring at the screen blankly before opening a message thread with my best friend, Mark. He was the only person I could talk to right now, the only one who might understand. But as I typed out a message, I realized I had no idea where to start. How do you tell someone your marriage is falling apart because your wife just slept with her boss at a swinger party? Before I could hit send, I saw a message pop up, Mark, checking in like he always did when he hadn't heard from me in a while. It was simple. Just a, hey man, everything good, but it made my throat tighten with emotion. I stared at the message, feeling the weight of everything pressing down on me, but I couldn't bring myself to reply. Not yet. I didn't even know how to explain it to myself, let alone someone else. I put my phone away, leaning back on the bench as the wind rustled through the trees, the chill biting through my jacket. I sat there for what felt like hours, lost in the stillness of the night, until my tears finally ran dry. I didn't have any answers and I wasn't sure what would happen next, but one thing was clear: I couldn't keep running from this. Eventually, I'd have to face Sarah, and we'd have to decide what came next, whether that meant fighting for our marriage or letting go of what was left. With a heavy heart, I made my way back home, feeling like a stranger in my own life. The house was dark and quiet when I returned, and Sarah was nowhere to be seen. I found her in the guest room, curled up on the bed, her back turned to me. She didn't look up as I walked in, and I didn't say anything as I leaned against the doorway, watching her shoulders shake with silent sobs. For the first time in our relationship, I didn't know what to say, didn't know how to bridge the chasm that had opened up between us. So I just stood there, the silence between us heavier than any words could ever be. The days that followed were a blur of awkward silences, unspoken words, and simmering tension. Sarah and I moved around each other like strangers, our home suddenly feeling like a prison with walls that echoed every painful memory. I avoided her eyes, and she avoided mine, each of us trapped in our own world of regret and resentment. It was as if we were living on the edge of a cliff, teetering precariously, not knowing which one of us would fall first. Mornings were the worst, awkward encounters in the kitchen where we'd exchange forced, meaningless pleasantries while pretending not to notice the lingering pain in each other's eyes. I'd make my coffee in silence, avoiding the spot at the kitchen island where we used to sit together, talking about our plans, our hopes, the mundane details of life that now seemed like another lifetime. Sarah would mumble a half-hearted, "Good morning," her voice so low it barely registered. We were coexisting, but that's all it was, surviving, not living. At work, I tried to drown myself in tasks, staying late to avoid coming home, pretending that the extra hours were necessary. My colleagues noticed my distraction, but I brushed off their concerns, plastering on a fake smile whenever someone asked if I was okay. I couldn't bring myself to tell anyone the truth. It was too raw, too humiliating. I wasn't ready to be the guy whose wife cheated on him at a swinger party. I didn't want their pity. I didn't want anyone to see how broken I really was. One evening, Sarah tried to break the silence, her voice tentative as she approached me in the living room. I was sitting on the couch, staring at the television, but not really watching anything. She sat down beside me, keeping a careful distance, her presence timid and hesitant. "I've been thinking," she began, her voice wavering, "maybe we should talk to someone. A therapist? Or a counselor, to help us figure this out." I stared at her, unsure of how to respond. Therapy? It felt like a band-aid on a gaping wound, but maybe she was right. Maybe we needed someone to help us navigate this mess, to say the things we couldn't say to each other. Still, a part of me resented the idea. Why should I sit in a room and pour out my heart when she was the one who'd crossed the line? But deep down, I knew that if we had any hope of moving forward, we'd have to face this together. "I don't know," I said, my tone edged with frustration. "Do you really think talking to a stranger is going to fix this?" Sarah bit her lip, her eyes glassy with unshed tears. "I don't know what else to do. I don't want to lose us. I don't want to lose you." Her words hung in the air, heavy with sincerity. I wanted to believe her, to feel the same urgency to make things right, but I was still so angry, still so lost in the betrayal that I couldn't see a clear path ahead. I ran a hand through my hair, feeling the weight of it all crushing me. "I need time," I said finally, not wanting to commit to anything. I don't know what I want right now." She nodded, looking defeated, and I hated myself for not having a better answer. We sat there in silence, the distance between us growing wider even though we were inches apart. It was a silence filled with unspoken apologies, with the painful understanding that neither of us knew how to fix what we'd broken. A few days later, Sarah made the appointment with a therapist, and though I still had my reservations, I agreed to go. The office was small, dimly lit, and smelled faintly of lavender. The therapist, a middle-aged woman with kind eyes, welcomed us in and asked us to sit on the worn leather couch. As we settled in, I felt a knot tighten in my stomach. This was real now. We were really doing this. The session began with the usual pleasantries, and then the therapist asked the dreaded question, "What brings you both here today?" I glanced at Sarah, and for the first time, I noticed how fragile she looked. Her usually confident posture was slumped, and her hands fidgeted nervously in her lap. She hesitated, and then she spoke, her voice cracking under the weight of her confession. I messed up. I hurt him, and I don't know how to fix it. The therapist nodded, her expression compassionate, but not pitying. Sometimes, when people feel disconnected, they make choices that hurt those they love. But acknowledging that pain is the first step. Sarah's eyes filled with tears, and I could feel my own walls beginning to crack, my anger mixing with the hurt I'd been carrying. She wasn't just some villain in this story, she was my wife, the woman I'd loved for years, and seeing her so broken was like a punch to the gut. I wanted to hate her, to cling to my anger, but watching her unravel made it impossible to deny that she was suffering too. I just wanted something, Sarah continued, struggling to find the right words. I felt invisible, like I was losing myself, and I didn't know how to tell you. David, he noticed me. He made me feel seen. The therapist nodded thoughtfully. And what about you? She asked, turning her gaze to me. How have you been coping with what happened? I hesitated, feeling the lump in my throat grow. I'm angry, I admitted, my voice thick with emotion. I'm angry that she did this, angry that I didn't see it coming. But mostly I'm just sad. I miss what we had, and I don't know how to get back to that. The therapist gave a small, understanding smile. Healing takes time, and it's okay to feel everything you're feeling. The important thing is that you're both here, willing to try. That's a start. The session continued, filled with painful truths and awkward silences, but for the first time, it felt like we were trying to claw our way back from the edge. Sarah cried openly, and I found myself tearing up too, letting out emotions I hadn't realized I'd been bottling up for so long. We were both raw, exposed, but at least we were finally being honest. When we left the office, the air between us felt lighter, though still heavy with unresolved tension. It wasn't a magic fix, but it was something, a tentative first step toward healing, or at least understanding each other's pain. As we got back into the car, Sarah reached for my hand, her touch tentative and unsure. I hesitated for a moment, then squeezed her fingers lightly. It wasn't forgiveness, not yet, but it was a small gesture, a sign that maybe, just maybe, we could find our way through this. Thank you, she whispered, her voice barely audible over the hum of the engine. I didn't respond, but I held onto her hand, letting the contact speak the words I couldn't yet say. We drove home in silence, but this time, it didn't feel quite as empty. There was a long road ahead of us, and I didn't know where it would lead, but for the first time since that night, I felt a tiny flicker of hope. Maybe we weren't as broken as I thought. Maybe, despite everything, there was still something worth fighting for. Weeks passed, each day a fragile dance between hope and despair. Sarah and I continued therapy, peeling back layers of hurt and resentment that had been buried beneath years of unspoken fears and unmet needs. Some days felt like progress, others felt like we were just spinning in circles, lost in the wreckage of what had once been a happy marriage. But slowly, we started to find a rhythm. The silences grew less suffocating, and we began to have real conversations, not just about the affair, but about us, about where we'd gone wrong and what we wanted for the future. We spoke about the dreams we'd abandoned, the intimacy we'd let slip away, and the fears that had driven us apart. It was painful, raw, and often uncomfortable, but it was necessary. We were rebuilding something, though neither of us knew if it would be enough. One evening, after a particularly tough session, we sat in the living room with a bottle of wine, the quiet hum of the TV filling the space between us. I glanced at Sarah, noticing how she fidgeted with her glass, her gaze distant. I knew she was replaying the therapist's words, just as I was, examining every wound, every scar we'd inflicted on each other. Finally, she turned to me, her eyes glistening with a mix of determination and sadness. I want to be honest with you, completely, she said, her voice trembling. I know I've told you parts of why it happened, but I've been holding back, because I was scared you'd hate me even more. I set my glass down, feeling the familiar knot tighten in my stomach. Just tell me, Sarah. Whatever it is, I need to hear it. She nodded, taking a deep breath. It wasn't just about feeling invisible. I was jealous of you. Your success, your confidence, the way you seem to have everything figured out. I felt like I was always in your shadow, just your wife, not my own person. And then David came along, and he made me feel like I was special, like I was something more than just an accessory to your life. Her confession cut deeper than I'd expected, but it also brought a strange sense of clarity. I'd been so wrapped up in my own anger that I hadn't considered her perspective, hadn't seen the ways I'd unintentionally made her feel small. It didn't excuse what she'd done, but it made it make sense, in a painful human way. Sarah, you were never just my wife, I said, my voice thick with emotion. I've always been proud of you, of who you are. I'm sorry I didn't show it. I'm sorry I didn't see you were struggling. She looked down, her tears spilling over as she nodded. I just got lost. I made a terrible mistake and I hurt you. I don't expect you to forgive me, but I want you to know that I never stopped loving you. Not for a second. I stared at her, feeling the weight of her words settle over me like a heavy blanket. Forgiveness was still a long way off, but for the first time, I felt a flicker of something, understanding, maybe even compassion. She was hurting too, carrying her own burdens of shame and regret. We sat in silence for a while, the tension easing into a tentative peace. It wasn't perfect, but it was real. I reached for her hand, and this time, there was no hesitation. She squeezed it, holding on like it was a lifeline, and for once, it felt like we were in this together. A few days later, as if life hadn't thrown enough at us, I got a call from David. I almost ignored it, but curiosity got the better of me. I stepped outside, letting the cool evening air wash over me as I answered. "What do you want, David?" I asked, my voice cold. There was a long pause before he spoke, his tone surprisingly subdued. "I just wanted to apologize. For everything. I know I can't undo what happened, but I needed to say it." I was taken aback by the sincerity in his voice. This was a man who rarely showed vulnerability, who thrived on control and power. Yet here he was, sounding almost human. "I appreciate the apology," I said, not really sure what else to say. "But I'm not sure it changes anything." "I get that," David replied, his voice tinged with regret. "Lisa's left me. She found someone else, and honestly, I don't blame her. I messed up and now I'm paying the price." Hearing him admit his own failures felt strangely vindicating, but also sobering. We were all caught in this web of mistakes, each of us trying to find our way out. "Good luck, David," I said simply before hanging up. It was the closest I could get to closure with him. Back inside, I found Sarah sitting at the kitchen table, scrolling through photos on her phone. They were old pictures of us, smiling, happy, wrapped up in each other's arms. The life we'd built, the memories that now felt so distant. She looked up, and I could see the pain in her eyes, the longing for the simplicity we'd once taken for granted. "What do you want to do now?" I asked, feeling the weight of our choices looming over us. She stared at the photos for a moment longer before setting her phone down. "I want us to keep trying. I know it's not going to be easy, and I know I don't deserve it, but I'm not ready to give up on us." I nodded slowly, the anger that had been my constant companion beginning to loosen its grip. I wasn't sure what the future held, but I knew one thing. I wasn't ready to give up either. Not yet. We spent that evening talking, really talking about everything and nothing. We laughed about old times, cried over the things we'd lost, and slowly, painfully, began to piece together the fragments of what we had left. It wasn't a perfect resolution, and maybe it never would be. But it was something, a chance to rebuild, to reimagine what our life together could look like. That night, for the first time in months, we fell asleep in each other's arms. It was tentative, fragile, but it felt like home. And as I held Sarah close, I realized that maybe, just maybe, we had the strength to survive this. Not as the people we were before, but as the people we were becoming, flawed, scarred, but still fighting, still hopeful. The road ahead was uncertain, filled with bumps and bruises we'd have to navigate together. But for the first time in a long time, I felt something I hadn't felt in months, hope. And that, more than anything, was worth holding on to.